have this claim that the church isn't the building, it's the people.
Mm-hmm.
No, the church is definitely a building. And that building is meant to be protected in certain ways. And the things that go on in that building are meant to be protected in certain ways. And the space that is that building is a religious space. And that means it has protection in certain ways. And it's the government's job to protect that building in specific ways.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Tom Saruf, and we're joined again by Miles Smith, who's professor at Hillsdale College. So, Miles, welcome back to Conservative Conversations.
Thanks, Tom. It's wonderful to be back with you.
And last time we talked about statues and civilization and the South and culture, and that was a very fun conversation with Marlo. But today, you and I think we're going to focus more on the talk that you're going to be giving for honors on the topic, which also happens to coincide with a new book that you're soon going to be coming out with. And I think by the time that this episode comes out, it'll be available for pre-order. So we'll tell all of our listeners now to pre-order the book, and we'll tell them at the end. But to start, how about you tell us a little bit about this book project you've been working on, and we can move from there.
Yeah, so it's really a history of the relationship between Christianity, religion broadly, but mainly Christianity, with institutions in the early republic, education, social institutions like the church, an institution like the church that's both social and religious, political institutions, civil institutions, cultural, customary institutions. And so it's really a history of how religion interacts with those things in between about 1780 and 1860. So the generation of political happenings that go on. The subtitle of the book is From the Founding to the Civil War. And so the Civil War is kind of a nice natural place to cut things off. And so I basically am proposing that we need to think about that era, because it's going to help us understand the relationship between religion and institutions in the 21st century. In the 20th century, and especially in the late 20th century, there developed this idea of we call it faith, or our personal relationship with our faith community, whatever. And the fact of the matter, I want to sort of push that out and say, no, religion is an institution. It's an institution, particularly Christianity, that's a churchly one, and the church has certain rights. And Christianity has certain rights. That doesn't mean this isn't an establishmentarian proposal. A Jew could make a similar argument about their synagogue, but that religion's meant to be protected in a particular way. And so what we've done in the 21st century is we've very much understood what that particular way of protecting religion is supposed to look like. And so I'm basically saying, no, the Constitution created a certain way, and it was understood to be a certain way for a generation. And that while they weren't necessarily, right about everything, obviously there's slavery and certain racial things that were distasteful in the era, but they're also right about some things. And so I want to quit letting the Warren Court of the 1960s dictate what the actual American settlement on religion was supposed to be. And so I think it's good to go back and see what the original settlement was.
Hey there, listener. I wanted to take a quick moment to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission here at ISI is educating for liberty. If you'd like to join us in fulfilling our mission, consider helping us by rating and reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Now, back to the show.
For sure. Before we go and dive deeply into that original settlement of the founding era, and then the antebellum period, the sort of first and second generations of the constitutional republic, on the 20th century, it seems that they actually take what was religion, which is this sort of institutional thing in which people participate, and it makes certain claims on the individuals in it in a way to sort of form them in line with the religious teachings and the moral teachings of that institution, whether it's, Presbyterian Church USA, the Catholic Church, Southern Baptist Convention, Jewish synagogues, what have you. There's a move towards deinstitutionalizing those things, making them all individual, and then even in a way, by doing so, making religion just a conscience claim, so that, the atheist or the Pastafarian can also be subject to the same claims as religion. And the sort of Satanism statue debacle that happened in Iowa a couple months ago sort of reminds me of that. There's this sort of debate of, like, does this person have the same right under the First Amendment jurisprudence as, the rights of, putting up a crucifix in the Iowa State Capitol or something like that. I'm just wondering how that specific flashpoint could maybe elucidate the sort of thing that you're talking about.
Yeah, well, the founders wouldn't have understood. So, like, the people, we won't call them the founders because I'm a historian. I can't use politics language, right? Like the revolutionary generation, or whatever you want to call them, they don't understand religion as merely a conscience claim, right? Like, I feel like I'm a religion, therefore I did. No, they wouldn't have understood it that way. Religion's an institution. It's meant to be protected. And so I think, for example, you might have heard this at some point. There's this, we'll have this claim that the church isn't the building, it's the people. Mm-hmm. No, the church is definitely a building. And that building is meant to be protected in certain ways. And the things that go on in that building are meant to be protected in certain ways. And the space that is that building is a religious space. And that means it has protection in certain ways. And it's the government's job to protect that building in specific ways. And so what we've done, and it was sort of you had the rise of quote unquote evangelicalism, which emphasized sort of like the personal relationship aspect of religion. Simultaneously, of course, the Warren Court is taking religion out of the civil spheres and political spheres. So very purposely removing certain things. So this kind of twin rise is what gives, I think, an idea of a deinstitutionalized religion, of an unchurchly religion, and so those both things are bad. Christianity, I think, is more than the church. I have friends who go to Catholic high schools. Is a Catholic high school somehow not a religious institution? I think it is a religious institution. Is a Catholic hospital, or Elvis died in Baptist Hospital in Memphis. And most of my cousins were born in Presbyterian Hospital in Charlotte. So, like, the fact of the matter is, religion's an institutional thing too. And so, what I'm hoping to emphasize is that the framing generation, the founding generation, understood that. They understood religion as an institution that had social, civil, and political influences and effects in society, and they wanted to protect it because they understood it was important.
All right, let's move there then. You're a historian. Historians use historical evidence, and they're trying to parse together all of the data and to make something coherent, not sort of ideologically cut if you're doing your job well, but try and make sense of the understanding of a people at that time. My understanding is that in the Everson decision was it 1947 or in the 60s, something like that, they saw the idea of the wall of separation as coming from the founding generation. They almost, not that they avowed themselves as being originalists, but they almost used this sort of originalist way to look back into the past and make their arguments or arrive at a judgment that way. What do you look for as, if not the dispositive evidence, as the sort of good evidence to look for to say this is how they understood these things?
There's a wonderful book that's edited by Carl Esbeck and Jonathan Den Hartog. University of Missouri Press published it, and it's on disestablishment and sort of the disestablishment in religion between 1776 and I think it's 1833 is the final date when Massachusetts disestablishes its congregational church. But one of the points that they make, and in full disclosure, I wrote a chapter in that book for my former home state of South Carolina. One of the points they make is that the belief that the First Amendment applied to states in the way we understand that, no one in the founding generation believed that.
Right.
So they don't think that the First Amendment is applicable to state within the states the way we do. So right off the bat, there was no state that incorporated the First Amendment in its religious, in the religious provisions in its constitution in the era. None of the new states do it. None of the old states go back and do it. The closest one you have is Virginia, but even still, it stops well short of what we would call sort of First Amendment type religious protections. And so right off the bat there, it's anachronistic when we say the First Amendment. We're talking about the First Amendment as we understand it's been applied for the last half century. That wasn't the case in the Revolutionary era. No, it doesn't mean that they did it right or that we're doing it wrong, but it does mean that you have to sort of confront the fact that not everybody thought religion meant this thing in 1801 or 1811 or whatever that is. So right there you have, I think, a difference, an important difference, because so many people, we sort of say, well, it's always been this way. Well, it hasn't always been this way. And the states themselves aren't trying to revolutionize religion in the era. We've overstated the revolutionary tendencies in the late 18th century, for sure. And so that's kind of sort of first little piece of evidence that should make us go, okay, wait a minute. What are they actually trying to do here?
Yeah, that's interesting. And, for the people who do say it always has been this way, it certainly seems that I'll use the founding generation understood religious liberty and robust religious freedom and even toleration to also coincide with various state enforcement of, I'm familiar with Jefferson, who's certainly not the most orthodox Christian, lowercase orthodox Christian amongst the various groups of founders that we tend to lump those people in with. But he had a bill at the same time protecting religious freedom, and then the next bill was a bill to punish Sabbath breakers. So
right.
Are they contradicting themselves? Or do they see, or just it's more like, do they have a different view of how these things fit together?
Well, I'll give you two answers. One is I don't think they see it as inconsistent. So it doesn't mean you don't have to be a Christian to observe the Sabbath. That's one of the things that everybody appeals to, that the Sabbath is natural. And that's one of the reasons why Sabbatarian provisions stay so long in the books. Now, a lot of people would quick to say, well, when you say the Sabbath's natural and that's not Christian, that's really a distinction without a difference. You have to believe in Christian, or at least Judeo-Christian precepts about the Sabbath to think it's natural. And that's maybe a fair criticism. I actually think that's true in some ways. The other thing I would just add is Jefferson's not as much the norm as we've made him out to be in the era. Most people didn't land where Jefferson did on the religious, the understanding of religious freedom and religious toleration. So he's not as much the norm as he's been sort of made to be. One of the interesting things is Jefferson's sort of devotees on the ground are almost always some sort of evangelical, particularly Baptist. He writes that letter, the separation letter, to a Baptist association in Connecticut. Mm-hmm. And it's telling that he's writing to them in Connecticut. He's writing to Baptists who are sort of not thrilled about the fact that there's a Congregationalist establishment still in Connecticut, and Jefferson's the anti-establishmentarian. There's plenty of people who disregard Jefferson altogether. The state of New York is a good example. New York is completely disinterested in the Jeffersonian settlement, and the New York courts maintain a pretty throaty de facto establishment. It doesn't have a state church, but it has an established religion for sure. And so the degree to which that's the norm is a lot of the debate. I don't think Jefferson's as much the norm as he's been sort of broadcasted to be, made out to be. So
I think that's also helpful. And if he's not the norm and even he's doing these things, what does that say about some of the other early people? What about right. South Carolina? Don't they reestablish after the First Amendment, which is of course not binding or incorporated on the states, but don't they reestablish in the 90s or the 80s?
They do. They effectively create in 1790 what's sort of a general establishment. So there's a general protection of Christianity, of Protestant Christianity, but of course in a place like South Carolina, Catholics and Jews are able to be sort of honorary civil Protestants. And so they're sort of written in to a large degree. North Carolina will be a much later thing. It will actually have Protestant provisions in its constitution. But after 1835, Catholics are lumped in, even as they make anti-atheist provisions stronger. Jews, a lot of people bring up the state of Jews. I have this in part of the book. Jews are sort of honorary Protestants very early on. So if you have a Protestant establishment, you would basically say, well, hello, Jewish community. We're Protestants. Can you affirm that we're Protestant, that you're Protestants? And a lot of the Protestant provisions are very anti-Catholic. And so Jews are like, oh, sure, we can answer those questions in the affirmative. And so, boom, there you go. You're an honorary Protestant. So the states had ways of working around this, but no one ever sort of stops and thinks, oh, we should annihilate the Christian provisions in our constitutions in order to include Jews. That just doesn't seem to have been much in the way of something they thought they needed to do. And so Jews are fairly well treated in places like North Carolina and South Carolina, even as they have de facto Protestant establishments.
That's interesting, because I guess then it's almost a mere Christian. I don't know if integralism is the word, but the sort of mere Christian coalition or governing force.
It would have been understood to be you're supporting Christian institutions. You don't need a Christian state or a Christian nation to support Christian institutions. And in my book, I use that term. I'm calling it Christian institutionalism. You didn't need to be a Christian nation. You didn't need to have sort of a Christian state. Why? Because you understood the state protected all of these Christian institutions anyway. And so they would have understood that, of course, we're a Christian people. Why? Well, because we have all these Christian institutions. Why wouldn't we be? And so the language of our debate over Christian nationalism is in some ways asking the wrong question.
And what's the question that's being raised with Christian nationalism? Because I mean, it's the term almost defines itself, but it's something that's really blown up, and now it seems to be getting some traction in the popular press, albeit in an unintelligent way.
Right. I think that Christian nationalism is an attempt to sort of talk about this, but it's an attempt usually by evangelicals who don't have the same relationship to institutions and politics as either the older mainline and to a lesser degree Roman Catholics do. So, for example, the idea of Christian nation, it's typically it's political, right? Mm-hmm. It's sort of meant to capture a sort of what I think is sort of seen as a socio-political ethos and drive people to vote in this way. The difference between Christian institutionalism and what I think of as Christian nationalism is Christian institutionalism is older and sort of has a history, and Christian nationalism is typically just political. It's just working its way out in electoral politics, typically. And I think there's some people who would identify as Christian nationalists who recognize the need for education to play a role in this. So I wouldn't say everybody who's a Christian nationalism is just interested in politics. I just think the term is too broad for it to be really meaningful these days, because people who like the term, almost everything they like becomes Christian nationalism, and people who don't like the idea of Christian nationalism, everything they don't like becomes Christian nationalism. And so I think the term's a bit too broad to be useful in that sense. And so, and I say that in the book. That doesn't mean that everybody who thinks about it or likes it or dislikes it is wrong about everything. I just don't think the term's particularly useful.
Oh, that's interesting, because I was talking with Mark David Hall like about a month ago. He was at ISI doing a seminar on the book that he co-edited with Daniel Dreisbach. The two of them were here, and we're doing a seminar for graduate students, our Weaver Fellows. And he's got a book coming out in a couple months. We'll have to have him on the podcast at some point to talk about it. But basically, his book is responding to Christian nationalism, but also responding to the people in the popular press or people who are really sort of sounding the alarm bells and saying, this is actually not as huge a threat because it's not that big. But it's interesting because the idea of America being a Christian nation intuitively makes sense. I'm Catholic, so it's the contours or how it looks is a little bit different. And when you read the history as a Catholic, you see some different things, or some things that are more challenging for you, perhaps. But the idea that religion is integral or important for politics, that seems to be something that almost every founder would have believed and would have acted on, either in proclamation or in law or in state constitution, something like that. And the idea that we're a nation.
You're right. They don't think they're remaking the wheel, and Professor Hall's work is outstanding. I commend everything he writes to anyone listening. No, I think that's right. I mean, the problem with the language of Christian nationalism today is it's usually oriented towards politics, and however efficacious it might be in that sense, I think usually it ends up just being significant because it's political. I think that the reason why I like Christian institutionalism is because institutions are valuable whether or not they have a particular partisan political affect or not. So your education, it might have a political affect, but it's more important than that. A hospital, right, there might be a political consequence of something it does, but it's more significant than that. So I think Christian institutionalism is just a better way of understanding how, yes, the American nation, and by nation, I think they typically mean the government, but I'm not, even this word nation, I don't love because I don't think of America as really mapping very meaningfully onto historic ideas of nationhood either. And so if they sort of mean the American Republic, well, I think it's almost better to say it's a Christian republic than a Christian nation, because the republic rests on certain socio-civil institutions that sort of prop it up, schools, churches, and all of that stuff. So again, I think the term is so fluid; it's hard to pin down.
Yeah, so you're saying Christian institutionalism, the institutions are doing things that you would do for your own sake, regardless of any political end. Though the institutions, any institution, will have some sort of political affect. But these are done and inspired by the spirit of Christian brotherhood and the biblical worldview, things like that.
Yeah, fraternity and Christian duty and all of that stuff. So, like, if you're a Catholic nurse at a Catholic hospital, right? You are observing Catholic, canonical, stipulations about what you can and can't do in the medical. That might have a political effect. But you don't do it because it's political. You do it because you're Catholic. And I think that's the way we should understand institutions and their lives in the United States.
Historically, in the early period, there's strong the institutions of civil society, of churches, of communities, very strong. This is something Alexis de Tocqueville points out. This is one of the things that's so interesting or worthwhile to him in his analysis of America. And I'd love to hear some examples of across the country, because the country, of course, all the states are different. They retain their idiosyncrasies. So what are some of these examples of Christian institutions that you point to as being helpful?
One of the best ones I can find, and it's snazzy because it so flies in the face of our expectations. State universities in the antebellum era routinely, North and South, great example, Michigan, University of Indiana, University of South Carolina, three very different institutions, very different places. All of them had a professor of the evidences of Christianity.
Really?
Yeah, so this is a state-paid intellectual whose job is to defend Christianity. And this is something that it's jarring to us. We said, no way. Well, no, that's how deeply wedded the American educational intellectual apparatus was to even something like Christian apologetics. It was just hard to separate them. And so, does a state university have a political effect? Well, yeah, it's meant to educate and catechize the leaders of a given state, and it's meant to sort of present what the state believes is fundamentally important about itself to its future scholars and future leaders. But it's also more than that. Education is more than merely political while being political. And so I think it's important to understand that they thought that, yes, it was important to have a professor of the evidences of Christianity in state universities. Why? Because it's just something that's important for people in politics and people in other fields to know. And so that's jarring to us. Imagine, and some of these things are hired like in the 1850s, even as quote unquote secularization begins, it's not actually secularizing that much. And so you have, I mean, a lot of the state universities are headed by clergymen, Protestant clergymen. The faculties and the curriculums are loaded up with what we would think of as almost pro-Christian dialectics. So you can't get away from it. Education was seen as a Christian enterprise. It's able to be a secular enterprise because it's not a churchly enterprise. So I think it's important to understand when they say secular, they just mean it's not the church. And so what's happened in the 20th century is that we've said, well, if it's not the church, it's not Christian. Well, that's clearly nonsense, right? There's Catholic hospitals. There's a Presbyterian hospital. There's Presbyterian schools and Catholic schools. Whatever confessional group you might have, there's other institutions that they're working their Christianity out with. And so I think that's just one example, the way that Christianity intersected with education. There's a whole book to be written on this. I mean, it's just ad infinitum. It's ubiquitous.
It's very interesting. How do they deal with the problem? Maybe they don't see it as a problem of we're going to have state-sponsored education. We're going to have state-sponsored education about Christianity, its reasonableness, and defending it. We're going to have this sort of mere Protestant or mere Christian, which also could include the small number of Jews who were in the early Republic. How do they avoid the problem of this particular minister or professor has particular views that might cut in favor of one group versus the other? And does that become like a political hot potato? Like, oh, I want the professor has got to be evangelical, and this might not be a stated thing by the legislature, but some people are going to use the faction to sort of push the Episcopalian, and then the Catholics might be trying to infiltrate with a Catholic professor. Have you seen anything about those issues or that sort of inter-Christian strife in that respect? Or
they're very careful to hire guys who don't have reputations for loud sectarianism. Having said that, some of their guys would sound to us very sectarian, and the fact of the matter is, it was sort of understood that it's our guy, and we've hired him, and if you have a problem with it, deal with it. So, for example, that the University of Wisconsin hires a Congregationalist minister, and there was some concern, hey, is he going to be one of these guys who's going to fire-breathing abolitionist? And this is 1849. And the state government of Wisconsin just basically says, no, he's our guy. Deal with it. And so so the idea that any complaint brought by any potential minority, religious minority in the antebellum era, the idea that the state would immediately grant them standing sort of level of charge, it's just not the case. Right? If you want to get rid of this thing, vote somebody in. And so that makes us uncomfortable, I think, because we want to think that any given group who claims standing deserves to be heard, but that's just not how the early republic operated. For example, right, there is no sort of atheist professor at very many of these places. In fact, Jefferson tries to install one at the University of Virginia, and it's uproar. The state legislature says no way, and they force against him. And why? Well, because there might be some people who are free thinkers in Virginia, but that didn't mean they need to be controlling anything. And so they litigate what is democratic on very different terms, right? How do you get to have a say at the table? You win an election, right? How do you get to, right? They don't have these bureaucracies that we do. When you win an election, we'll listen to you. Why does the state of New York, for example, sort of take a little bit different tack on this stuff? Why? Well, because a large minority of Irish people begin to win elections in the 1860s. And so, okay, now we'll listen to you. And so the idea that anybody can just claim standing like, hi, I feel oppressed. That's not how the early republic worked.
It makes sense to me. It's Jefferson's first inaugural. What does he say? The majority must rule. In order for his rule to be rightful, it must be reasonable. But the majority must rule. We're going to have our people take control, and they're going to control power, and they're going to set the agenda, and that's a function of the democratic process. And no one's rights are being violated per se by teaching particular things or people pursuing particular policies. That's just how it works.
And I think this is important. They understood that democracy and religious liberty went hand in hand. And so what that meant was that, guess what? If the majority wants something, they're going to get it. Think about the treatment of the Latter-day Saints. Early Latter-day Saint movement is not treated very well, right? And there's a few people who say you have the right to live. And there's actually some politicians who kind of jockey for the Latter-day Saint vote. But why do they end up having to go to Utah? Because not even the politicians who say, hey, we believe you have religious liberty are able to sort of overwhelm the Democratic tide, which elects people who are like, no, they don't. And so democracy is messy. And I think that's the fact of the matter. Democracy and religion is quite messy. There is no clean, everybody's rights are always observed at all times. And that sounds bad to us, but that was how they understood democracy in the era. And in some ways, they're more honest about it than we are. You hear all the time about our democracy. Well, so much of that means it's code for a certain sort of socio-political ideal, and not actually for the working out of that which is properly democratic in an institutional sense.
Yes, that's something I've observed. Is our democracy means the various liberal initiatives, policies, and values that we hold dear. And if those lose, that's a threat to our democracy. And if they win, then the opponents are a threat to the democracy. But focusing still, keeping it on the topic of religion in the early republic. Man behind me, George Washington, where does he fit into all of this? Whether it's his particular religious views or how he saw religion and democracy, or religion and the early republic going hand in hand.
There's a letter that's a lot of people understandably appeal to, where Washington writes to a synagogue,
the Hebrew congregation
in Newport, Rhode Island, says we're here to protect you. You have rights too, and I think Washington's right to do that. I don't see that as inconsistent with the rest of the Federalist Party, which wanted to retain establishmentarian structures quite aggressively. And one way to think about this is, at the time, Whig politicians in Great Britain are still, the majority of them want to keep the state church, the state Anglican church, and they also want to enfranchise Jews and Roman Catholics. And so I think of someone like Lord Macaulay in the British context, who's able to say, yeah, I support, he famously says, I support capital punishment, the state church, and I forget one other thing. He goes, I'm a liberal still. I want to enfranchise Jews, enfranchise Catholics. I support capital punishment in the state church. And so the idea that sort of you have to choose, that liberalism is inconsistent with all those things, is a 20th century thing. In the 19th century, no one thought those were inconsistent. And so you can have Washington, who I think is very serious about inclusion of particularly Jews, because there's a philo-Semitic tradition in the United States from its founding. And I think that's a good thing, a beautiful thing about the United States. But that American philo-Semitism wasn't seen as inconsistent with the retention of state churches, for example, in New England. Or in the mid-Atlantic states, or particularly in South Carolina, where you have a large Jewish population and a de facto, not de jure, but a de facto Anglican establishment well into the 1790s.
Interesting. Okay, I want to ask, you end the book at 1860. The Civil War is, I think, a very natural sort of end point for the book, because you have let's say, a major disruption to the institutional structure of things. That's the understatement of the year so far. But how does the Civil War, we talked last time about statues and civilization, the Civil War and Reconstruction plays a major role you might call it a new founding. You might say it's just a continuation. The various debates to be had over Lincoln's legacy and the legacy of the Civil War. But in your view, how does Reconstruction, the Civil War, bear, and the spirit of those things too, not just historical facts, but also sort of I don't want to say the ideology of the Civil War, but like how does that period and what happens, those transformations, affect what we saw with respect to religion and institutions and in terms of religion and religious liberty?
That's a great question. It's probably either another book I'll do or someone needs to do it. As I read through the information for this book, one of the things I've really thought about is this question of what changes. I think one of the things that changes is the generation of Protestant leaders that had sort of ends their time in the 1860s. You have a lot of guys die during the Civil War. So James Henley Thornwell, president of the University of South Carolina, well-known Southern intellectual, dies in 1862. William Meade, the Episcopal bishop, well-known Episcopal bishop of Virginia, dies during the war. You have a series of these guys who die. And so after the war, you have an almost complete absence, North and South, because some of these guys are Northerners too. Some of these important guys are Northerners who die in the same era. You have a complete absence of an older sort of gentrified idea of religion. And so you are much more likely to have someone who is part of this kind of burgeoning, I don't want to call it evangelical because I don't like that word because it's too big to be useful.
Yeah.
But they're far more influenced by the ideas of New England abolitionism. You just don't have that same mid-Atlantic Southern sort of what I like to call establishment. The cultural establishment isn't there. So after the Civil War, because of the Freedmen's Movement, the Freedmen's Bureau, and just the growth of a specific ideology in Protestant churches, you have a different way of looking at religion. I think it's telling that the United States becomes more xenophobic in some ways after the Civil War than it is before the Civil War. And one of the reasons why is because you have sort of a triumphalism in American Protestantism that wasn't there beforehand. And so I think there's a lot of those different things that change. I mean, you have just a different generation running things. And there's a lot of people say what's the theological changes, it's intellectual changes. All that's true. I also just think there's a difference between some sort of gentrified guy who's born in 1780 running a church than someone who's born in 1830 or 40.
I think it's a great point because it's not just institutions that run themselves, but it's also
right.
You know, in some sense, the people embody an institution, and I don't want to sound Wilsonian, but they have the power or the zest for life to
that's true.
To move the institution in a certain direction.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a lot of different. There's a book on that by Stephen Green's The Second Disestablishment. It's a good book. I think it's useful. I'd like to see someone who maybe likes religion a little bit more weigh in on the subject. But there's useful answers out there. I just don't think they're the complete answers.
Sure. All right. Well, Miles, I know you've got a hard stop, and this has been a good conversation. Gives us a better sense of the things. It's good to talk to you too, Tom. But if people want to find your book, where should they look for it? And like last time,
the Davenant Institute Press will be there will be a link out soon. You can follow me on Twitter at @IvyMiles. I'll publish the link because I want you to buy it because I want it to sell because I'm a mercenary and self-serving like that, like all good academics should be. So, but anyway, yeah, there'll be publicly available links, and so yeah, it should be out here in the next month and change. So.
Awesome. Well, this is great. We will promote it ourselves. And for all the students who are attending the Honors Conference or maybe not attending the Honors Conference, this is a taste of things to come. Thanks again, Miles.
Thanks, Tom. Take care.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, debates, lectures, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.